4 months after President Donald Trump declared a break from the past on what he called Liberation Day, the world is beginning to feel the weight of that declaration. A sweeping wave of new tariffs, ranging from 10 to 50%, has been imposed on dozens of nations that have not signed bilateral trade agreements with the United States. These measures are not symbolic. They are structural and immediate. Markets responded first and fast. Within 30 minutes of the announcement, equity indexes across Europe began to fall. In Asia, markets mirrored that decline. When trading opened in New York, the reaction was swift and sharp. The Dow opened lower, the Nasdaq dipped, and investors began reevaluating not just corporate earnings, but the very assumptions undergirding international trade relations. What was once dismissed as rhetoric is now policy. The tariff regime announced today will begin to take legal effect in 7 days. But for some countries, Canada foremost among them, the consequences have already begun. Goods imported from Canada are now subject to tariffs between 25 and 30%, effective immediately. Mexico has received a 90-day extension, a temporary reprieve, as negotiations continue. Others have not been so fortunate. Brazil, originally assessed at a modest 10% rate, has now been hit with a staggering 50% levy. India, 25%. The European Union, Japan, and South Korea, all facing penalties of 15%. Only the United Kingdom has avoided the harsher terms, emerging with a base tariff of 10%. And yet, conspicuously absent from this list is China, for now. A separate 90-day pause remains in place for Chinese exports. That pause expires on the 12th of August. The silence on Beijing is not a sign of peace, but a sign of delay. A final window before escalation. Beneath the technical language of tariff schedules and economic clauses lies something deeper, a recalibration of power. President Trump has not been secretive about his intentions. He has framed this as a second economic revolution, one aimed at restoring American dominance in manufacturing, trade, and strategic leverage. He calls it a golden age, but golden ages are rarely built without resistance. The rationale from the White House is simple and ruthless. The global trade system, according to Trump and his advisors, is designed to constrain American productivity. It shifts labor overseas. It allows competitors to flood U.S. markets with subsidized goods. And it binds Washington to multilateral deals that dilute American sovereignty. This, in their view, must end. And tariffs, long dismissed as relics of the past, have become their preferred weapon. In economic terms, tariffs act as taxes on imported goods. When they rise, the price of foreign products climbs. In theory, this should favor domestic producers. In practice, the outcome is more complex. Today's job report offered a sobering early indicator. The number of new hires in the previous month was 73,000, well below economists' expectations. Even more concerning, the data for the prior 2 months was revised downward. Corporations are pausing. Hiring plans are on hold, and uncertainty is becoming the dominant climate across boardrooms nationwide. At the heart of this shift is a strategic gamble that other nations, when hit with painful tariffs, will return to the negotiating table under Washington's terms. But already, fractures are visible. India, for instance, has responded not with concessions, but with counterdemands. New Delhi refuses to compromise on agricultural protections, citing the existential threat of genetically modified U.S. goods undermining its small farmers. On the energy front, India remains defiant. Its oil imports from Russia will continue. That, it says, is non-negotiable. Brazil is in revolt. The 50% tariff slapped on Brazilian exports, particularly coffee, one of its largest industries, has triggered widespread protests. In Sao Paulo, streets have filled with demonstrators accusing Washington of economic blackmail. The background to this move is unmistakably political. Former Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro, an ally of Trump, is now facing prosecution for alleged involvement in a coup plot. Analysts believe these tariffs are not about trade balances, but about pressure. A message to Brazil's judiciary and to the current government under President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. That message is not being received well, and this is only the beginning. In Brasilia, the official response has been restrained, but firm. President Lula da Silva has made clear that Brazil's judiciary is independent. The United States, he said, has no standing to interfere. There would be no back-channel compromise, no political deals traded for economic relief. And yet, behind the scenes, there is growing pressure within Brazil's own domestic factions. Agricultural producers, some of whom once supported Jair Bolsonaro, are now bearing the cost of a 50% tariff that directly targets their largest export. Coffee, once a symbol of Brazil's global strength, has become a flashpoint of geopolitical retaliation. The broader consequence is not limited to diplomatic friction. It is structural. Brazil remains one of the world's top 10 economies. It is a member of BRICS, and it has long attempted to balance its economic dependence on U.S. markets with regional autonomy. The tariffs have upset that balance. Suddenly, the calculus has changed. If Brasilia concludes that Washington is prepared to weaponize trade policy in defense of political allies, the entire premise of Brazil's foreign policy will shift. And that shift will not happen in isolation. Argentina, Chile, Colombia, and others are watching. What happens to Brazil could happen to them. This is the second layer of Trump's economic doctrine. Tariffs are not only a tool of domestic stimulus, they are a form of diplomatic leverage. Where traditional alliances fail to yield compliance, economic pain may be more persuasive. India offers another example of the policy's mixed results. The 25% tariff announced on its exports affects labor-intensive sectors, textiles, leather, gems, and other manufacturing domains. These industries employ tens of thousands. For exporters, the impact is immediate. Order books have dried up, contracts are stalled, and the uncertainty is multiplying. The Indian government has responded through a dual-track strategy. On one side, it refuses to budge on agriculture. India's protectionist food policies, tariffs, subsidies, and restrictions on genetically modified imports are seen as essential to the survival of its smallholder farming economy. On the other side, New Delhi is treading carefully around its energy links with Russia. Moscow remains India's top oil supplier. Replacing that capacity is not an option. Washington may object to India's Russian ties, but India's position is clear. It will not subordinate its energy security to U.S. demands. That clarity is not defiance, it is calculation. At the same time, India is far too valuable a market for U.S. corporations to ignore. From Apple to Tesla, India is no longer just a manufacturing base. It is a consumer market of over 1.4 billion people. Both sides know the stakes, and both sides are holding firm. The geopolitical implications of this standoff stretch far beyond commerce. India's positioning between East and West, between the United States and Russia, between democratic partnerships and regional pragmatism, places it at the center of a new, multipolar alignment. The tariff war is testing that alignment. Within the United States, the ripple effects are already materializing. On Wall Street, volatility has returned. Investors are struggling to project earnings as input costs rise and supply chains fracture. Industries that rely on imported components from automotive to technology to food packaging are being forced to reconsider their forecasts. Take, for example, the case of Brooklyn Deli, a small business built on importing spices and packaging materials to produce sauces domestically. The company sources cumin, chili, and coconut from India. Glass and lids from Taiwan and China. The manufacturing happens in the United States. But every component of the product, except labor, relies on foreign suppliers. The new tariffs directly threaten that business model. Not because it offshores labor, but because it participates in a globalized economy that no longer aligns with Washington's policy objectives. The owner of Brooklyn Deli, Chitra Agrawal, has made it clear. Product launches are on hold, hiring is frozen, innovation suspended. The company is not moving jobs abroad. It is not engaging in unfair trade. It is not outsourcing. And yet, it is collateral damage. This contradiction strikes at the heart of the Liberation Day strategy. Tariffs are supposed to incentivize local production. But when the production is already local, and the supply chain is still punished, the logic breaks down. The reality is that the United States no longer produces many of the components required for its own industries. Glass containers, specialty spices, electronics, even basic industrial chemicals. Tariffs do not create factories overnight. They create scarcity and friction. The economic data is beginning to reflect that reality. Inflation projections have been revised upward. Consumer prices are expected to rise not only for foreign goods, but for any product that relies on imported components. In a tightly integrated global economy, that includes nearly everything. What emerges is a system of strategic contradictions. Tariffs are applied to incentivize domestic industry, but they punish companies already producing domestically. They are framed as a defense of sovereignty, but they attempt to influence the internal affairs of other nations. They are designed to stimulate employment, but initial data shows a freeze in hiring and investment. And yet, from the perspective of the Trump administration, this is not failure, it is pressure. And pressure, they believe, will eventually force movement. This is not about short-term pain, it is about long-term leverage. The principle underlying the new tariff doctrine is not novel, but its application is unprecedented in scope. For decades, the United States has used trade policy as a tool of influence. During the Cold War, selective access to the U.S. market was granted to strategic allies. Tariffs were lowered for partners aligned against the Soviet Union, and raised for nations seen as adversarial or non-compliant. What separates the Liberation Day agenda from previous chapters is its universality. This is not a selective economic weapon deployed against rogue actors. It is a broad-spectrum reordering, a deliberate upending of the global trade hierarchy, engineered through unilateral leverage. The aim is not to punish one nation, it is to compel many. In past eras, the United States relied on multilateral institutions to enforce its trade preferences. The World Trade Organization, the G7, the Bretton Woods system. Those institutions, while still formally in place, have lost their centrality under the Trump administration. In their place, bilateralism, one-on-one deals, terms dictated not by consensus, but by dominance. This approach is visible in the contrasting treatment of different nations. Mexico, given a 90-day extension. The United Kingdom granted reduced tariffs. Canada hit immediately with severe penalties. India and Brazil sanctioned, despite being key regional democracies. The pattern is not ideological. It is transactional. Countries that offer strategic concessions or are in negotiation are granted flexibility. Those that resist or pursue independent foreign policies are penalized. This framework, though criticized as coercive, is consistent with a broader shift in American geopolitical posture. Under President Trump, the traditional foundations of U.S. foreign policy alliances, shared values, multilateral frameworks have been deprioritized in favor of economic nationalism, bilateral leverage, and conditional engagement. This is not isolationism. It is a redefinition of engagement on American terms. Critics argue that such an approach is self-defeating, that by alienating allies and undermining global institutions, the United States is creating a vacuum, one that China, Russia, or regional blocs will exploit. Supporters counter that the post-Cold War global trade system, built on assumptions of endless liberalization, no longer serves American interests. They view the multilateral era as one of decline where the U.S. sacrificed economic advantage in exchange for global stability and received neither. The Liberation Day tariffs are the material expression of that critique, a strategic rejection of the old order and a bet on unilateral dominance. But as with any such reordering, there are limits. And the most significant of those limits is China. Beijing has so far been spared from the new wave of tariffs, but the 90-day pause expires on the 12th of August. There is no indication from either side that a breakthrough is imminent. When it arrives, the tariff decision on China will be the true stress test of Trump's doctrine. In the past, tariffs on Chinese goods were targeted and selective, focused on specific industries such as steel, electronics, or intellectual property violations. What is being contemplated now is more sweeping. A full reimposition of levies across most categories of Chinese imports, potentially exceeding 35%. The implications are vast. The United States imports over $500 billion worth of goods from China annually. Tariffing even a portion of that volume at elevated rates would not merely affect pricing, it would rupture supply chains. From consumer electronics to industrial machinery to basic retail inventory, U.S. companies depend on Chinese inputs. Decoupling is a long-term project. Tariff escalation is an immediate disruption. And yet, the political calculus in Washington increasingly favors confrontation. The bipartisan consensus on China has hardened. Strategic competition is the default posture. And within that frame, tariffs are seen as both punishment and pressure. But Beijing is not passive. In recent months, China has deepened trade ties with Southeast Asia, strengthened its economic influence in Africa, and expanded its Belt and Road footprint across Central Asia and the Middle East. The threat of U.S. tariffs may push Beijing not toward compromise, but toward acceleration of these alternative pathways. The message to its partners is implicit. The United States is unpredictable. China, by contrast, offers long-term deals without moral lectures or sudden penalties. Whether that message will resonate remains uncertain, but what is clear is that the terrain is shifting. The world is no longer anchored by a single trade superstructure. Competing systems are emerging, parallel supply chains, competing standards, divided markets, and the Liberation Day doctrine is accelerating that division. As the effects of the Liberation Day tariffs unfold, it is not only superpowers and strategic rivals who are repositioning, but also the middle powers, the nations too large to ignore, too small to dictate terms, and too interconnected to remain unaffected. South Korea, one of the most technologically advanced nations in Asia, has been assessed a 15% tariff. The official justification was the absence of a bilateral trade revision. But beneath that explanation lies an unspoken warning: reliance on multilateral trade agreements will no longer be sufficient. Seoul's predicament is emblematic of a larger pattern. Economically, it is deeply integrated with the United States, but it also maintains complex, often tense relationships with China and Japan. The tariffs force South Korea into a narrow corridor of choices, each with strategic implications. Should it pivot closer to Washington and accept new bilateral terms that may disadvantage its exporters? Or should it explore regional alternatives, such as expanding trade through the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, or deepening ties with China's export framework? Neither path is without cost. Japan faces a similar calculus. The 15% tariff, while lower than Brazil's or India's, is still significant. Tokyo must weigh not only its trade portfolio, but its security relationship with Washington. A stronger economic rift could bleed into defense coordination, joint technology ventures, and diplomatic unity on key issues such as Taiwan and North Korea. Europe, too, is feeling the strain. The European Union has not yet secured a revised agreement with the United States. As a result, it has been lumped into the same 15% category. The symbolism is deliberate. For decades, the transatlantic alliance was underpinned by mutual economic benefit. The post-war order depended on trust, consistency, and shared norms. The tariffs are a signal that those assumptions are now suspended. France and Germany, traditionally the EU's economic anchors, have responded cautiously. Both are aware that retaliation such as reciprocal tariffs or regulatory barriers risks escalation. But passivity carries its own risks. Across European capitals, discussions are intensifying about supply chain resilience, energy independence, and the growing need to hedge against American unpredictability. The result is not immediate abandonment of U.S. partnership, but quiet diversification. Europe is strengthening trade ties with Latin America. It is accelerating its green energy transition to reduce dependence on foreign hydrocarbons. And it is quietly enhancing digital infrastructure cooperation with Asian democracies, sidestepping U.S. tech hegemony. These are not acts of rebellion. They are acts of risk management. At the center of this rebalancing is a single question. Can the United States be trusted to maintain stable economic rules of engagement? For multinational corporations headquartered in the U.S., that question has taken on new urgency. Major exporters, particularly in agriculture, automotive, and consumer goods, are beginning to speak out. Soybean farmers in Iowa, car manufacturers in Michigan, electronics producers in California, all depend on international markets. Tariffs that provoke retaliation or reduce demand directly threaten their bottom lines. Industry associations, while politically cautious, have warned of rising input costs and regulatory uncertainty. Financial analysts have revised earnings forecasts downward for companies heavily reliant on foreign components or overseas buyers. The Federal Reserve, though formally neutral on trade policy, has acknowledged the inflationary pressures that tariffs may introduce. Consumer prices are rising, input costs are increasing, and the anticipated growth in domestic manufacturing has yet to materialize at scale. For small and mid-sized businesses, the situation is more acute. They lack the margin buffers of global conglomerates. They cannot easily absorb 25 or 50% increases in supply chain costs. Hiring freezes, canceled product launches, paused expansion plans. These are not abstract concerns. They are immediate realities. And yet, the political coalition behind the Liberation Day doctrine remains intact. Within Trump's base, tariffs are framed not as economic burdens, but as strategic weapons. Supporters argue that short-term pain is necessary to restore long-term sovereignty, that outsourcing was never sustainable, that economic discomfort is proof the system is being challenged. This view has traction. In key swing states, manufacturing towns hollowed out by decades of trade liberalization are watching closely. For many voters there, the idea that Washington is finally fighting back carries emotional and political weight. But within the broader political establishment, fault lines are emerging. Some Republicans, traditionally aligned with free trade orthodoxy, are growing uneasy. Wall Street donors are signaling concern. Moderate Democrats, especially those representing export-heavy districts, are pressing the Biden-aligned factions of their party to take a clearer position. So far, the institutional pushback remains muted. But pressure is building. The central question now is whether the tariff doctrine can survive a second economic shock. If inflation spikes, if unemployment rises, if global retaliation escalates, the political foundation of the policy may begin to crack. Until then, the system will bend, and if necessary, it will be made to bend further. For now, there is no turning back. The decisive front in the unfolding economic confrontation remains just beyond the horizon, but not for long. On the 12th of August, the 90-day pause on tariffs targeting China is set to expire. There is no indication, diplomatic or economic, that an agreement is imminent. The silence from both capitals is telling. Beijing has issued no public overtures. Washington has offered no concessions. If the tariffs are implemented, as expected, they would cover a broad range of Chinese exports, electronics, rare earth elements, machinery, and consumer goods. Early projections suggest levies between 30 and 35%. The shock to global trade would be immediate. For years, China has been the largest source of imported goods into the United States. In 2022, the figure stood at over $500 billion. A sudden price surge on those goods, triggered by tariffs, would ripple across every sector of the U.S. economy. From smartphones to appliances to pharmaceuticals and solar panels, American consumers and businesses rely on Chinese supply chains not just for affordability, but for scale and speed. Replacing that capacity is not a matter of months, it is a matter of years, and in some sectors, perhaps decades. The Trump administration, however, is not operating from a purely economic playbook. The strategy is geopolitical. The goal is disentanglement. Decoupling from China, once considered an extreme position, has now become mainstream across both parties. In Congress, legislation aimed at banning Chinese semiconductors, telecom hardware, and even social media platforms has advanced with bipartisan support. The logic is not only economic dependency, but national security. The argument is that Chinese components embedded in American infrastructure pose vulnerabilities either through backdoor surveillance, critical supply shortages in crisis, or strategic manipulation of global choke points such as rare earths. Tariffs, in this context, are not penalties. They are barriers. Barriers meant to buy time for domestic reindustrialization, for reshoring, for the reassertion of sovereignty over critical inputs. But the scale of this ambition far exceeds the current capacity of the U.S. industrial base. In rare earth refining, China holds over 70% of global capacity. In solar panel production, over 80%. In electric vehicle battery manufacturing, over 60%. And in active pharmaceutical ingredients, over half of the world's supply originates from Chinese factories. The challenge then is not simply to disrupt, it is to rebuild. Rebuilding requires time, capital, and coordination, none of which come easily. China, for its part, is preparing for confrontation. In recent months, Beijing has signaled readiness for what it terms economic containment. It has ramped up domestic consumption initiatives, increased state support for strategic industries, launched a new wave of Belt and Road infrastructure financing, and quietly reduced its holdings of U.S. Treasury bonds. Beijing understands the stakes. The tariffs are not just about trade balances. They are about who sets the rules of the next global economic system. And China, as it sees it, will not play second to a hegemon intent on economic warfare. What is emerging is not a trade dispute. It is an ideological contest. In Washington, the narrative is that globalization has weakened American power, hollowed out its middle class, and left the nation vulnerable to supply chain sabotage. The response is economic nationalism, industrial policy, and protectionist leverage. In Beijing, the response is strategic autonomy. The goal is to build a parallel system, one not dependent on Western financial institutions, supply routes, or digital standards. And in between, the rest of the world is being forced to choose. The European Union, ASEAN, the African Union, Latin American trading blocs, all are facing mounting pressure to align with one system or the other. The choice is not purely economic, it is infrastructural. It is regulatory. It is technological. From 5-gram networks to AI governance to currency standards and energy dependencies, the division is becoming binary. Liberation Day did not cause this bifurcation, but it has accelerated it. Multilateral institutions, the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank now find themselves increasingly sidelined. Their ability to enforce norms, mediate disputes, or guide integration is eroding. Instead, what we are seeing is a return to spheres of influence, shaped by tariffs, defense agreements, and technological exclusivity. This is not a cold war, but a cold economy. An era where dominance is asserted not through armies, but through standards, supply chains, and market access, where the currency of power is not territory, but technological supremacy and industrial resilience, and the battle lines are hardening. There is historical precedent for using trade policy as a form of coercion. In the early 20th century, the British Empire maintained global influence not merely through military power, but through control of sea lanes and financial networks. The pound sterling was not just a currency, it was a mechanism of discipline. The United States inherited this model after the Second World War, through the Bretton Woods system, through the Marshall Plan, and through control of global institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Washington set the terms of global recovery and trade. But there is a critical distinction between then and now. The post-war American order was built on expansion, on integrating allies into a liberal trade regime that promised prosperity and security in exchange for alignment. The Liberation Day strategy is built on restriction. Tariffs are not offered as incentives, but as threats. Access to the American market is no longer guaranteed, it is conditional. The era of generalized benefit is over. The era of selective penalty has begun. That model may work in the short term. The U.S. economy remains the largest in the world. The dollar remains the global reserve currency. Wall Street is still the center of global capital. And U.S. consumer demand shapes the export patterns of dozens of economies. But dominance is not permanence. Economic warfare carries long-term risks, especially when applied indiscriminately. In the 1930s, the United States implemented the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, a sweeping set of duties meant to protect domestic industries during the Great Depression. The effect was catastrophic. Retaliatory tariffs from other countries followed. Trade collapsed. The global economy contracted further, and political extremism rose in the vacuum. That lesson remains etched in the memory of economists. Trade policy, when deployed without coordination or restraint, can become a catalyst for systemic collapse. Today, the risks are different, but no less real. If the United States imposes tariffs on too many partners simultaneously, and if those partners respond by seeking alternative alliances or forming counter-coalitions, the end result could be a global economy fractured into mutually exclusive zones. Already, signs of this fragmentation are evident. The BRICS bloc, comprising Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, has proposed a new development bank, a digital payment system, and even discussions around a shared currency framework. None of these are immediate threats, but they represent a shift in ambition. Likewise, regional trade frameworks are gaining ground. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, led by China, now includes 15 Asia-Pacific nations. The African Continental Free Trade Area has begun implementing tariff reductions among its 54 member states. The message from these blocs is clear. If the global system is weaponized, alternative systems will be built. And the cost of exclusion from those systems may not be visible today, but it will be felt in the long term. For the United States, this poses a structural challenge. Can it enforce its preferences while maintaining legitimacy? Can it shape global trade without alienating key partners? Tariffs alone cannot answer those questions. Economic leverage is not infinite. It must be renewed through credibility, through performance, through leadership. Already, U.S. companies are lobbying for exemptions. Industries from agriculture to aerospace are requesting waivers, warning of job losses and lost market share. Lawmakers from both parties are fielding complaints from constituents facing rising prices. Retailers are adjusting inventories. Logistics firms are rerouting supply chains. Manufacturers are delaying investments. This is not the behavior of an economy in ascendance. It is the behavior of an economy adapting to uncertainty, caused not by external shock, but by internal policy. And yet, the political capital behind the Liberation Day strategy remains intact. Supporters view disruption not as failure, but as evidence of action. The long-standing belief that America has been exploited by foreign competition has taken hold, and tariffs are the most visible instrument of retribution. The result is a paradox. The United States is using its economic power to punish allies, to isolate competitors, and to force a realignment of global trade. But in doing so, it may also be accelerating the erosion of the very system that granted it that power. There is no guarantee that a fragmented world will still revolve around Washington. And as more nations build redundancy into their trade strategies, as they diversify suppliers and explore non-dollar transactions, the gravitational pull of the United States will weaken. This is not immediate collapse. It is strategic attrition, a slow drift, away from a world defined by a single anchor. 4 months into the post-Liberation Day era, the contours of President Trump's vision are beginning to take form. It is a world less reliant on multilateral institutions, less tolerant of diplomatic hedging, and less forgiving of economic dependence on competitors. It is a world governed by leverage, calculated, transactional, and unapologetically asymmetric. Supporters of the tariff doctrine see it as a necessary correction, a bold reversal of what they perceive as 3 decades of strategic surrender. They point to the offshoring of manufacturing, the rise of China, and the stagnation of American wages as proof that the liberal trade consensus has failed. In their view, economic pain is not collateral damage, it is part of the cure. And yet, the very ambition of this vision ensures its volatility. The global economy was not designed for zero-sum recalibration. It was built on scale, interdependence, and distributed specialization. No single nation, no matter how powerful, can unilaterally remake that system without consequence. The Liberation Day tariffs may achieve tactical concessions. Some countries will fold. Some industries will realign. Some factories may return. But the deeper currents are moving in the opposite direction. Nations once confident in the stability of U.S. trade policy are now reassessing their risk exposure. Strategic autonomy, once a theoretical objective, is becoming an operational priority. The pillars of U.S. economic leadership consistency, openness, and institutional trust are now under revision. This has consequences far beyond trade. Economic fragmentation feeds political fragmentation. Alliances fray. Joint ventures stall. Intelligence sharing weakens. Military coordination becomes more difficult. Sanctions lose effectiveness. And the United States, once the architect of global consensus, finds itself increasingly alone in a system it no longer controls. This is not isolationism by design. It is strategic, narrowing by default. A world defined by tariff zones, parallel infrastructure, divergent standards, and disconnected supply chains is not merely inconvenient, it is unstable. Crises, economic, environmental, or military, do not pause for system recalibration. They expose its weaknesses. A global order built on friction rather than cooperation is less able to respond to pandemics, to financial contagion, to food insecurity, or energy shocks. The gamble, then, is not just economic, it is systemic. President Trump's bet is that the United States is resilient enough, rich enough, and powerful enough to endure the disruption it imposes on others. That it can remake the rules of engagement and still sit at the center of the board. It is not an impossible bet, but it is a high-risk one. For now, the numbers are holding. The U.S. remains the largest economy. The dollar remains the global reserve. U.S. capital markets remain liquid. Its military alliances, though strained, remain intact. Its corporations remain innovative. But in this new world, dominance must be constantly enforced. Each deal must be negotiated, each exemption bargained, each ally reassured or punished. It is a doctrine of constant motion. The Liberation Day tariffs have not only redrawn trade routes, they have redefined the logic of American power. No longer diffused through systems, it is now centralized through disruption. And in that disruption lies opportunity and danger. Opportunity for nations willing to recalibrate quickly, to form new coalitions, to align strategically with emerging blocs and create resilient regional systems. Danger for nations caught between spheres, dependent on global trade flows that no longer guarantee stability, facing price shocks, political backlash, or coerced alignment. And for the United States itself, the most dangerous outcome may not be confrontation, but entropy. A world that no longer resists Washington's policies because it no longer depends on them. A world where decisions are made elsewhere, quietly, incrementally, beyond the reach of tariffs, sanctions, or executive orders. A world after Liberation Day. 4 months into the post-Liberation Day era, the contours of President Trump's vision are beginning to take form. It is a world less reliant on multilateral institutions, less tolerant of diplomatic hedging, and less forgiving of economic dependence on competitors. It is a world governed by leverage, calculated, transactional, and unapologetically asymmetric. Supporters of the tariff doctrine see it as a necessary correction, a bold reversal of what they perceive as 3 decades of strategic surrender. They point to the offshoring of manufacturing, the rise of China, and the stagnation of American wages as proof that the liberal trade consensus has failed. In their view, economic pain is not collateral damage, it is part of the cure. And yet, the very ambition of this vision ensures its volatility. The global economy was not designed for zero-sum recalibration. It was built on scale, interdependence, and distributed specialization. No single nation, no matter how powerful, can unilaterally remake that system without consequence. The Liberation Day tariffs may achieve tactical concessions. Some countries will fold, some industries will realign, some factories may return, but the deeper currents are moving in the opposite direction. Nations once confident in the stability of U.S. trade policy are now reassessing their risk exposure. Strategic autonomy, once a theoretical objective, is becoming an operational priority. The pillars of U.S. economic leadership, consistency, openness, and institutional trust are now under revision. This has consequences far beyond trade. Economic fragmentation feeds political fragmentation. Alliances fray. Joint ventures stall. Intelligence sharing weakens. Military coordination becomes more difficult. Sanctions lose effectiveness. And the United States, once the architect of global consensus, finds itself increasingly alone in a system it no longer controls. This is not isolationism by design. It is strategic narrowing by default. A world defined by tariff zones, parallel infrastructure, divergent standards, and disconnected supply chains is not merely inconvenient. It is unstable. Crises, economic, environmental, or military, do not pause for system recalibration. They expose its weaknesses. A global order built on friction rather than cooperation is less able to respond to pandemics, to financial contagion, to food insecurity, or energy shocks. The gamble, then, is not just economic, it is systemic. President Trump's bet is that the United States is resilient enough, rich enough, and powerful enough to endure the disruption it imposes on others, that it can remake the rules of engagement and still sit at the center of the board. It is not an impossible bet, but it is a high-risk one. For now, the numbers are holding. The U.S. remains the largest economy. The dollar remains the global reserve. U.S. capital markets remain liquid. Its military alliances, though strained, remain intact. Its corporations remain innovative. But in this new world, dominance must be constantly enforced. Each deal must be negotiated, each exemption bargained, each ally reassured, or punished. It is a doctrine of constant motion. The Liberation Day tariffs have not only redrawn trade routes, they have redefined the logic of American power. No longer diffused through systems, it is now centralized through disruption. And in that disruption lies opportunity and danger. Opportunity for nations willing to recalibrate quickly, to form new coalitions, to align strategically with emerging blocs and create resilient regional systems. Danger for nations caught between spheres, dependent on global trade flows that no longer guarantee stability, facing price shocks, political backlash, or coerced alignment. And for the United States itself, the most dangerous outcome may not be confrontation, but entropy. A world that no longer resists Washington's policies because it no longer depends on them. A world where decisions are made elsewhere, quietly, incrementally, beyond the reach of tariffs, sanctions, or executive orders. A world after Liberation Day.